Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're glad you are here to learn more about the Bridges program in DC. My name is Alex. I work for the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform, and I'll be handling the logistics for the webinar today. I'll give you a little bit of context before handing it over to our subject experts. Maybe we'll leave a few seconds here for more folks to log on since it just turned 1:30. But again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. All right, thank you so much for holding on a few seconds. I think we're going to begin. So welcome to Building Connections. Learn how the Bridges program in DC connects partners, advocates, and children to build trust through multi-system collaboration. We are so pleased to be here today to talk about this program, this amazing program with Mary Nelson, and to share some of the amazing insights and activities that she's up to, and perhaps hopefully give you a few action items that you can share with your jurisdiction tomorrow. So first, a quick mention about who we are. As you might know, we are the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform. The CJJR is a center within the Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. Our overall mission, which you can see on the slide, is to support development and advanced multi-systems approaches to juvenile justice reform. So we do this through a number of different ways. One of the ways is through certificate programs that we host both on site as well as in jurisdictions across the country. The topics that our certificate programs cover, they vary wildly, from reducing racial and ethnic disparities, school justice partnerships and divergent pathways, to transforming juvenile probation. So we're really trying to cover all the various topics that the frontline practitioners are facing in the juvenile justice and child welfare fields. We try to be an applied research center to figure out what's going on the ground and figure out what works. Outside of the certificate programs, we also have a number of practice models that we work with local jurisdictions to help implement, including the crossover youth practice model. We'll talk a little bit more about the crossover youth practice model a little bit later, so I'll just leave that there. So Before diving into the webinar, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the agenda. So first, we're going to do an introduction to CASA and the Bridges program. Next, we'll go over 3 action items that you can implement tomorrow in your own jurisdiction. When we were crafting this webinar, there's a whole host of things we could talk about. Some of them very big structural changes that you can and shifts that you can implement into your jurisdictions, but those conversations require, I think, a little bit more direct one-on-one interaction. So what we wanted to do first is to cover these sort of knowledge and action items that you can walk away from the webinar and then hopefully start thinking about and doing immediately. Then finally, we're going to go into questions. So hopefully you all will have a lot of questions to ask. We're going to hold off on the questions till the very end. I think in your dashboard, your webinar dashboard, there is a question little thing. And so if you can, if ever a question comes up during the presentation, please type it there and we will cover it at the very end. So I will now hand it over to Macon Stewart. She is the Deputy Director for Multi-Systems Approach here at CJJR, and she'll talk a little bit more about crossover youth, which we'll be talking about even more detail today. Thank you, Macon.
Alex. Thank you, Alex, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. Before I jump into these definitions, I just want to give you all a little bit of context for why we are holding this session. As some of you may or may not know, Alex mentioned that one of the things that we do at the center is that we have a model that's called the Crossover Youth Practice Model. To date, we have worked with 23 states, up to 120 counties within these various states in implementing this model of practice. And what the Crossover Youth Practice Model does is it improves how the systems work together for young people who are intersecting between child welfare and juvenile justice. But one of the things that we've learned over time is that while system alignment between these two systems is very important, one of the things that is also essential is having adequate supports for young people who find themselves involved in either one system or the other, or fluctuating between both of those. And what we've found in working with countless communities across the country is that having a CASA can make a world of difference for these young people. And so given our partnership with National CASA, and me having the opportunity of having met Mary and worked with her and learn more about the focus of her program specifically as it relates to crossover youth, we wanted to bring this wealth of knowledge to our network more extensively. As Alex said, our goal for today's session is to educate you all about what the Bridges program is in reference to, but to also give you all some action items of things that you all can be doing that are taken from lessons learned in their project. Again, most communities across the country have a local CASA program. And so what we want to challenge you all is to think differently about how CASAs can better support young people, because what we know from our work is that having a CASA in the life of a young person can make a world of difference. So really quickly, just want to give some definitional context to who crossover youth are. And these definitions come from the most recently released OJJDP study on dual system youth. And these are young people who are either at risk of crossing over from child welfare to juvenile justice, or from juvenile justice to child welfare, or they are involved in both systems concurrently. Now, all of you working in the system probably have some young people, let's say if you're in child welfare, who are exhibiting some at-risk for delinquency behaviors, or there may be some things that the system may be doing to this young person in an effort to provide services and support that may be increasing their risk for crossing over. So if a young person is at risk for crossing over or have crossed over, then they fall into that category of what we consider to be a crossover youth. There are variations of the definition that get very granular, that get you to from the place of being a young person who is at risk of crossing over to actually being a young person who has been duly adjudicated in both child welfare and juvenile justice system. And there are several different layers in between each of those where we can expound upon the definition of crossover youth. But in the most broadest sense of the word, it's a young person who has touched child welfare and has touched juvenile justice in some form or another. So that's who we're talking about when we think about crossover youth in the context of the work that we do here at the center. Next slide, please. So what I want to do right now is introduce you all to our guest presenter for today. I'm not going to read through her bio. You see it right there before you. But what I will say is that Mary has extensive experience having worked with CASA for some time. And the thing that I've appreciated about having learned about her work is the fact that she, based on her experience, identified a challenge that she saw young people to be going through as it relates to their involvement within the child welfare system, and saw a need for how her CASA agency could be doing something differently, and really took the approach of thinking out the box and developing a program that could best support these young people. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mary, who is our guest presenter today, and ask that you all really sit and listen attentively to the information that Mary is sharing as well. I'm sorry, before I turn it over to you, Mary, I do want to encourage you all, as Mary is going through her presentation, if you look within your dashboard, as Alex referenced to, there is a questions tab. So we ask that you, while we're going to save the questions for the end, you all can feel free to send in questions throughout the presentation, and we will be logging those questions in, and we will be asking them at the end of the session. So if you look in your dashboard, you'll see there's a questions tab. Click on that tab and type your question in, and at the end, we will get to all of those questions that you have. So without further ado, Mary, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Megan. And I especially want to thank both Megan and Alex for inviting me here today and for allowing me to share more about the Bridges program and CASA, because there's nothing more that I like talking about than our work, because it's such great work. And so we're going to start out by talking about what is CASA. Some of you may be familiar with CASA, or Court-Appointed Special Advocates. Court-Appointed Special Advocates are a national network of organizations that provide volunteer advocates to youth in the foster care system, and CASA DC is one of over 900 organizations nationally. I think we're in the majority of states. I think there's maybe 2 states that we're not in, but don't quote me on that. In some jurisdictions, CASAs also serve as guardian ad litem. In other jurisdictions where CASA or where guardian ad litems are required to be attorneys, CASAs serve in their capacity as a friend of the court. But in every circumstance, CASAs are volunteers who are appointed by a judge. They typically will serve as a partner in the youth neglect case. They go to court, they review court files, they review social files, they visit schools, they engage with services, and really the emphasis on the CASA model is to have an advocate who provides an objective and impartial perspective based on an interpersonal relationship that they're building with the youth. So you see, we visit with our youth at least twice a month. We really are trying to meet them where they're at to understand what their needs are. We report directly to the court. I always tell people we advocate for youth in and out of court. So when we go to court, we're making recommendations for services or referrals directly to the judge. We make recommendations for permanency planning to the judge through reports and oral recommendations. But we're also working with a team of service providers and attorneys and all the people who are working with the youth outside of court to make sure that things are going the way that they're supposed to go for this youth. And we focus, at CASA DC, we break it down into these 4 areas. Although nationally, other CASA organizations may break it down differently, typically these are the kinds of things that CASAs work on. So we want to make sure, and I'm going to go over education, life skills, and well-being first, because these are things that I think of as short-term and long-term. So on the short term, we want to make sure that youth are able to go to school and that they're supported in their education. They have the things that they need. We also want to make sure that youth are receiving services and experience in life skills, especially for our youth who maybe have AFLA as their permanency goal. If you're familiar, youth who are going to emancipate out of the system, that they have the skills that they need in order to be successful. And then we also focus on well-being, which is questions regarding the youth's mental and physical health, so that if they need to go to the doctor, that's being taken care of, they're being checked out regularly, or if they need therapy, they receive that. But then long-term, we also want to think of the goal for the foster care system is to provide permanency, so a safe and permanent home for this young person. So we want to focus on how can we make that happen, and what is that going to look like for this youth overall. I think I'm not going to read this slide, but the big takeaway from this is we're not replacing another person in the child welfare team. We're not social workers. We are not attorneys. We're not therapists. So the big takeaway here is we are trying to provide assessments of the best interest of the child based on our common sense observation and some of the training that we're provided. So now we're going to get into the meat of it. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the Bridges program is, because this is really a little bit different than other CASA organizations. At CASA DC, we have a number of programs that focus on special populations. So the Bridges program at CASA serves a special population of youth who have previous or current contact with the juvenile justice system. And in addition to taking referrals from the child welfare system, we also take referrals directly from our diversion court. For the referrals that we take from our diversion court, those youth may or may not have current child welfare involvement, although the majority of them have had child welfare involvement at some point in time. So we really are focusing on the needs of crossover youth with this program. The Bridges program evolved out of another program that we were working on at CASA, where we were just focusing on our diversion courts. And I took that over in 2018 and quickly realized that we were supporting the needs of those particular youth in juvenile justice, but we weren't focusing on the needs of all of the youth that we were working on who were encountering the juvenile justice system or were at risk of encountering the juvenile justice system. So after many discussions, a lot of research, many conversations with our community partners, we decided to make a change and to build the Bridges program. So with that, let me tell you a little bit about what makes the Bridges program a little bit different. And will they get a copy of the slides?
Yes, so we already had that question. So yes, we're going to send out a copy of the slides, and there's also going to be recording. So we'll send a link to the recording for all attendees.
So if you look back on the slide that we just had a few minutes ago, you'll see the mission statement. And really, I think of the Bridges program as CASA Plus, right? So all of that stuff that the mission statement is talking about, that's all stuff that we would normally do with our CASA advocates and our youth. But this, the fundamentals is kind of what are we doing different. So the first thing is that the program is supervised by a single case manager, that's myself, and that allows for all of those cases where the youth have touched the juvenile justice system to have consultation and a point person who has some expertise with both the juvenile justice system and child welfare, and particularly the juvenile justice system in DC, because as you know, systems are different in different jurisdictions. We provide extra training to those advocates who are working with these youth so that they have an understanding of what the juvenile justice system is like. And we also provide workshops where our youth are able to attend so that they have opportunities to participate in conversations about the justice system. We support crossover youth who are in formal and informal involvement with the justice system. Some of our youth go to out-of-court diversion. Some of our youth are arrested and their cases are no paper. We support all of these youth because we want to help prevent recidivism and stop contact at the very outset. There's an emphasis on mentorship and building interpersonal relationships, which is very, again, similar to that CASA model already. But one of the biggest things that we add is cross-team communication and support, because what we were noticing is that people who were professionals in the child welfare setting and people who were professionals in the juvenile justice setting were very siloed. And there are mechanisms for communication and case management to happen across systems in DC. But even so, the people who are working on the ground floor are struggling with how to have conversations and understand systems. So now that we covered the meat, we can get into the potatoes. And really, I was asked to specifically focus on things that you could do in your jurisdictions to take from this program and our, lessons learned in DC. So we're going to focus on three things. We're going to focus on building trust, recruiting volunteers, and then focusing on being youth-focused. So how can we effectively build trust in a multi-system collaboration? Let me say before I dive into the bullet points, the next three slides are very interrelated, and it's kind of like the touchy-feely stuff. And one of the takeaways, I think, for this is that you can create a posture of openness and humility and invite others to do the same by using that as an example. That's just so important because this is hard work that we all do. None of us come to this work because we want to get rich or, be important people. Typically, people want to help children and families. So we have to be very compassionate with each other. Remember that. So to start out, you want to come to the table with some knowledge, and that doesn't mean you have to start out with every meeting knowing there is. I think we recognize that one of the reasons we have to focus on these collaborations and cross-system programming is because that is something that doesn't necessarily exist already. So you don't have to be an expert, but think critically when you come to these meetings and you start having these conversations about what knowledge do you already have, why are you concerned about this issue in particular, what have you learned from your own programming, and how can you leverage that knowledge to start building effective change. And especially as you start to have more conversations with people, you're going to become more sophisticated in your understanding of your own system that you're working in, whether it's child welfare and juvenile justice, and your counterpart system. And then you can start to have even more sophisticated conversations about solutions either on an individual case with the client you're serving, or on a systemic basis where you can say, hey, if we did this little thing, it would really make a huge difference. In addition, I think that it's really goes a long way to building trust if you share information, and you want to share information appropriately. So one of the things you can do now is start thinking about how you're going to share information with other agencies and other organizations, because if you come to the table and you say, I can't tell you anything, I don't know what I can tell you, then that's going to start to tell people that you're not willing to communicate with them, or, there's no point in talking to you because you can't tell them anything. So before coming to the table, I think it's really critical to think about what can you share that's going to be helpful, but also what do you need to reserve in order to protect sensitive information and the privacy of our youth and families. I think one of the things we did that was really helpful is when we were building out the program, we shared our program model and we shared our training and policies and procedures with our community agencies and partners. And I think that was really helpful in showing them that we were willing to be open. We weren't trying to hide anything. We weren't trying to be adversarial. We wanted to know from them what they thought about what we were going to train our advocates on and the way that we were going to structure our program. And we wanted their feedback too, because I'm not an expert in juvenile justice. I came to this from a child welfare perspective and had to do so much learning. And so when it came to getting feedback from especially our juvenile justice partners, I wanted to know when I'd missed something or hadn't thought about something in a particular way. And with that, I think you want to be very open to listening to criticisms and concerns, because especially as different people play different roles in individual children's lives, they're very protective of their clients. They don't want to do anything that's going to cause them harm. And if you're approaching the situation as someone that they don't necessarily know or trust, they may be concerned that you are going to unintentionally do something that will cause harm. And so it's important to listen to the criticisms and concerns from the outset so that you can, one, make sure you don't cause that harm, but also to, again, create that posture of being open and willing to team with your community partners. And with that, there will be times when you don't agree about individual interventions or policies or procedures. And I think that one of the biggest things in terms of cultivating those relationships is disagree compassionately. You don't have to agree on everything. But again, remembering that we're all coming at this from a place of love and wanting to help our community and our children and families. And so we don't, nobody is here because they have malintent or want to destroy a child's life. So remembering, even when you see something where you say, well, that's not right, that's not just, that person doesn't know what they're doing. Those are really knee-jerk reactions, and maybe they're true, but you might have a more productive conversation if you say, I'm not sure that's the right intervention. Here's our reasoning for that, and a way that we can maybe resolve this or meet in the middle. These two bullet points are really pretty interrelated. I think that especially when you start to get higher up with the people who are crafting the policies and procedures for the way that we're going to engage with the individual youth and families, and also the procedures for the systems themselves, we start to get very concerned about things like liability, or people perhaps accusing us of not doing what's in the best interest of the child, or having different parties or people who we have to be accountable to besides the children and families. So maybe our policymakers who are dealing with the money or whatever. I think what's important to remember, it's important to remember those perspectives, because if someone doesn't know you or your organization, they may be very cautious of those particular issues because they don't want to open themselves up to liability or criticism. And again, nobody's here because they want to get rich or cause problems for children and families. So remembering that you're going to have to do a lot of relationship building, a lot of trust building, and that may be something that happens over a long period of time. And one of the things I'll say is that you can do is go to the meetings, go to the community meetings, go to the workshops, go join the task force. If you're not invited to join the task force, ask. Frequently people will say, wow, I didn't know that you were interested in this. Of course we want you here, because they want more community engagement. And as you start to be a part of these different conversations, and particularly in the field that you might not be a part of. So if you're coming from juvenile justice, you may not be a part of the child welfare community. And so you can start to kind of identify, where can I start showing up? Who can I start having conversations with? And over time, people will start to understand you do want to be a part of the conversation and what you're about. And so that's one really concrete thing you can do. Excuse me. I was asked to kind of give an example, too, of where this might happen. Do I have time to actually? Yeah. So early on, when we were reaching out to our community partners and seeing, who it is that was really working with our youth and families in the juvenile justice sphere, I had reached out to an organization and spoke to their director, and I was so excited. I was excited to get the call. I was always surprised by how many people were willing to talk to me. This measly program manager, supervisors, and these directors would be like, yeah, sure, I'll talk to you. So I'm really excited. I get on the phone, I start to talk about the program, and he stops me and he says, I have to be honest with you, I really don't know if I want to work with you. And I was like, oh, okay, tell me more about that. And, he went on to describe how he'd had this terrible experience years ago with our organization and was really fearful that some of the things that he had seen were, putting young people at harm from the perspective of their age. And that was not what the call was supposed to be about. I had no idea that I was going to have that conversation that day. But I really had to take a moment to humble myself, take a step back and say, well, I wasn't here 10 years ago, so I cannot be responsible for that. But I can say, that really sucks. And I want to hear why it is that you were concerned. And ultimately, we left the conversation with him saying, I feel better about working with you. I'm I want to work with you in the future, but, I'm going to think about it. And we were able to come back, and now we we have a really good relationship now and continue to work with each other. So that just goes to say, like, there will be people who say, I don't know you, or I had experience with your organization, I don't trust you, and you'll have to have those conversations. Now we're going to move on to recruiting and leveraging volunteers. And I know that not every agency or organization will be able to do this, but I think looking for the programs, like if you have a CASA program in your jurisdiction, that's where you want to kind of look and see where to leverage volunteer organizations. And I'll talk about why. So the first thing is that well-trained, I want to emphasize, they have to be well-trained and prepared volunteers. You can't just throw anybody in the ring and say, okay, go do great work. You got to train them. But when you have well-trained volunteers, they can provide capacity and perspective that's just different from people who are doing this on a full-time or even part-time basis as professionals. And part of that, and especially for our model, we only pair one volunteer with either one family or one youth. So if you have professionals who are working with 15 or even 30 different families or different young people, and they have, all of these different things going on, they may not have the same capacity that a volunteer who's only working with one other youth or family may have. So that's something to think about as well. And this is more of an observation than something you can do, but we ask our volunteers to make at least a year commitment, and we encourage them to continue volunteering for as long as the youth is court involved, which for some of our foster youth may be 2, 3, 4 years, unfortunately, but we have volunteers who do stick with it. And one of the benefits of that is these are fields that have high turnovers professionally. Social work and probation can be very heart-wrenching, and there is a tendency, I think, for people to leave after a year or two. Because volunteers are a little bit more removed, not that they also don't experience trauma, but they don't experience it on nearly as the same level. And so we see our volunteers stick around for longer, and they can provide longevity in the case in sort of a history. Like, they know what happened 3 years ago with this child. They know what their experience was with an individual service provider and can provide that institutional knowledge. And in the same vein, sometimes volunteers have more capacity to work outside of business hours. Sometimes they have a fresh perspective, which, sometimes people will find a little bit annoying. They're a little bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. But it also can be refreshing for someone to come in when you as a professional are saying, I'm just really tired of this kid, my wit's end, and then this person comes in and is like, let's get things done. I've never worked with this kid before. I'm not burnt out on them. And you can use that energy to say, like, okay, you're excited about working and you have ideas, go. I also find that our youth and families respect volunteers don't work for anyone. They don't work for the judge. They don't work for their probation officer or their attorney or anybody else. And I always tell youth, your volunteer has two bosses. They have me and they have you. And that's it. It's the only people they work for. I wanted to talk a minute or two about how do you retain those volunteers, because this can be, as we've talked about a few minutes ago, a very heart-wrenching field. How do you support them and make sure that they do stick around? The biggest thing is you have to train them, and they also have to feel supported. So we give our volunteers a standard 30-hour training. They do an interview, in addition to that, a background check, all of this different stuff. And then they do more training on the juvenile justice system. So they're very well prepared. But that being said, I still don't expect them to know everything that I know from my 3+ years of experience in child welfare and juvenile justice. It's just not possible. So they still need to be supported by someone who can very quickly answer questions, point them in the right direction, encourage them. I do a lot of hand-holding, a lot of listening to upset phone calls, and that's just part of being that support network for your volunteer. They can't go home and tell their spouse or friend about the frustration they have with their case, similar to our professionals because of confidentiality issues, but they can call me and tell me, for an hour if they need to, how they've had a bad experience and they're so frustrated. You want to be transparent and upfront about your expectations. So we really are very clear with volunteers, this is tough work. You do have to make a commitment to see your youth at least twice a month. You do have to make that year commitment, because if you don't stick around, you're another person who left this youth, who quit them. You do have to do the training. So some people see all that and they say, that's not for me, and we say, great, there's another volunteer opportunity out there that is right for you, and we're happy that you told us that this is not right for you before you got into it. And I think I've mentioned this a couple times, you have to provide effective training. If volunteers don't feel prepared, what I've noticed is when they get into the thick of it, they get frustrated and then they just kind of ghost you, because they just get so frustrated that they give up. One of the things we do is targeted recruitment. So we find that volunteers who are from the local community, volunteers who have had experience in child welfare or juvenile justice, it's not necessary and certainly not something that a volunteer who doesn't have that experience can't overcome. But those volunteers do have a particular perspective that we find that our youth and families really appreciate. Being youth-focused. I think one of the biggest things here is you really want to think about things from the youth's perspective. And that's one of the things we wanted to really instill in this program, is helping the youth to understand, especially when we're talking about how the perspectives change from child welfare to juvenile justice, where in child welfare, we really are very supportive of youth in the sense that we're not talking about things that a youth did wrong. We're talking about something that someone else did wrong. When it comes to the youth, we're talking about supporting them and lifting them up and making them really the center of things. In juvenile justice, and this isn't to say that there aren't trauma-informed courts or courts that are trying to do what the child welfare system does, but we're still talking about accountability for wrongdoing. We're talking about guilt. We're talking about an emphasis on something that that child did wrong and how they can make it right. I think in that system, it's really hard for that youth to understand how they can have a really meaningful role in the process, because it's not necessarily seen as a process versus an obligation. So that's one of the things we really wanted to focus on in the program itself. And I think that you can do this, if you're working with individual youth, you can do this today. So thinking about making sure that they understand their place in the system, they're not just a cog, it's a requirement they have to fulfill. They have a voice, and they also have some level of control, so they can do things like speak up. If something's wrong in life that's really preventing them from having success, they can talk about it with their attorney. And with that, I hear from a lot of young people that they really don't understand the roles of different people and the roles of the different court systems. So young people will say, I go to court, I don't know why I'm going to court. I know I've got like 3 cases, I've got to go to court. They know that they have attorneys. In DC, they have 3 different attorneys. They have an education attorney that represents their education decision maker, a defense attorney, and a guardian ad litem. And they'll say, you ask them who their attorney is, and they don't know how to answer. They don't know the different roles that these people play or how they interact with each other. They don't know who is a mandatory reporter. So I very firmly believe that our youth should know who they're talking to, when something is going to be kept private and when it can't be kept private, and we're disclosing that up front. I think it's respectful for the youth. But also, if you have to turn around and report something that they say, that immediately breaks down the trust that you have built with them. And I've seen it happen. And even if they don't know who reported, they will speculate. And even if they don't figure out exactly who it is, they'll think it's someone else, and that other person's relationship is destroyed. So it's important. It's both trauma-informed and youth-centered to help the youth understand who these different people are, what their roles play, how they can communicate, how they're communicating with each other. And these are all things that you can instill in your individual work with youth right now and also into the programming that you're doing. And with that, in order for you to be prepared to do the first two things, you need to educate yourself on the individual systems. So if you're an expert on child welfare, you have to go get some education on juvenile justice generally and how juvenile justice works in your individual systems. So really quickly, to summarize, challenge ideas that people, one of the most important things you can do is build trust and build that trust in a compassionate way. Be aware of different vantage points and roles that different play. So probation officers are coming at things from a different perspective than guardian ad litem. Defense attorneys are coming at things from a different perspective than CASAs or guardian ad litem. And it's really important for anybody who's working with these youth and the youth themselves to know those different roles and how that person is approaching the systems and the situation. Be fresh-faced, so be excited about your work, think of creative ideas, but be careful not to vilify other people when they aren't so. This is hard work. We have to be kind to ourselves, and we have to be kind to our other team members and service providers. It's not only important to be what's the word I'm looking for? It's not only important to recruit your volunteers, but also to train them, support them, and provide them with resources so that they can feel like they're not in a hopeless situation. And you also just want to consider things from the point of view of the youth and how they're feeling and how they relate to the situation. Yeah.
So now we'll move on to questions. So if anyone wants to ask any questions, please do so typing into the question field on your dashboard. So we'll just wait a few seconds. But I also want to take this opportunity to thank Mary for all of her insight, her wisdom, her knowledge. Very, very happy to have her here and to instill all this with us. Okay, so we have a question. Can you talk a little bit about the additional 2-hour training you provide?
Yeah, absolutely. So initially when CASAs come in, and this is true of any CASA program, not just DC, there is a 30-hour training. So that training weighs pretty heavily on policies and laws and procedures in the child welfare system. They're also trained on things like diversity, being trauma-informed, talking with youth and using age-appropriate language, you know, all the general things that we talk about when we're talking about youth-serving organizations. So the additional 2-hour training covers the juvenile justice system in DC because it's a different process and there are a lot of different avenues that a youth can take. So we want to make sure that the advocates are very prepared for understanding at what point their youth are in the juvenile justice system and what could potentially come next. So it covers that. We also cover crossover youth. We cover different perspectives of different team members in the juvenile justice system. So again, thinking about like what is the role and perspective of a probation officer? What is the role and perspective of a defense attorney? And particularly, how's that different from a guardian ad litem? Because they do have different legal obligations in representing their clients. What's a status offense versus a delinquency offense? What are some different tips for advocates who are working with youth in juvenile justice? So we go over things like visiting youth who are detained, advocating for diversion options. So one of the things that might not come up if the defense attorney working with the youth isn't very familiar with their background, you may know, hey, my youth has these circumstances that would qualify for them for this diversion program. You want to make sure to clue, your defense attorney in on that. Being careful about how to communicate. And actually, one of the things I didn't talk about in the presentation is we have very specific procedures about who communicates with who and how that communication happens. So for example, we submit court reports to, for juvenile hearings where the youth is in diversion. We do not submit court reports or make oral representations in courts where the youth is pre-adjudication, because we don't want to impact their the track of their adjudication. That's something that is better handled by their defense attorneys. What we do in those circumstances is we do conference with defense attorneys, and we talk about different ways that you should approach communications about youth, particularly in juvenile court. So I have a rule: you can't say something negative without first saying something positive. And if you have to say something negative about a youth, you're actually not saying something negative about the youth. You're talking about circumstances that you're concerned about, maybe something that they've done where their behavior is out of the ordinary. So the long and the short of it is, what you say about youth in juvenile court directly impacts the trajectory of their case. So we need to be trauma-informed and youth-centered. We have to say things like that.
So really connected to a couple of questions we just had. So do you write a court report for the juvenile justice court? If so, how is it different than your child welfare report?
Mm-hmm. So I just mentioned, we do not write court reports for youth who are pre-adjudication.
Got it.
We do conference with the defense attorney. We do write court reports for our diversion courts. The reason is that diversion courts are typically, the youth is post-adjudication or there are a few youth who could theoretically go back to court if they fail at diversion and go to trial. But the way that the courts are designed, there's a barrier on the information. So you can't take court reports from the diversion court and then use them in trial for a youth who was, they call it, certified back to their original judge. So meaning they got kicked out of diversion because they weren't successful at it. So that's why we write court reports there. The court reports are similar. There's not a permanency section. There is a placement section, so we talk about what their home life is like, where they're living. There are some placement options that we use who are in diversion courts. So occasionally shelter care is an option. It's not recommended very often from our perspective because it is technically a detention. But then we also follow that rule that I was just mentioning, is that our communication in court reports has to be youth-centered. So we always talk about the positives in that youth's life, community support in that youth's life. And then if we have to talk about something that the youth did wrong or that we're concerned about, we do it in a youth-centered way. So we don't just say, Timmy picked up a new charge for assault, he's just a hoodlum. We wouldn't say that in a court report anyway. But the tone, there's a tone, right? So instead, we might say something like, we're concerned because there's some new behaviors that we haven't seen with Timmy before. We would like, and there's formal language that we use. So this is a little bit informal the way I'm describing it. But, we would like to discuss what services can be put in place to address these new behaviors and how we can better support Timmy.
So we have a question. I work with a juvenile court in Northern Virginia, and we often get DC youth who are involved with the criminal justice system in DC, as well as foster care.
Yeah.
Is there a way for us to make referrals to the Bridges program, or a way to find out if youth is already involved?
I can't tell you if the youth is already involved. However, we do have a agency referral form that we for agencies. So we have what's called the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, which is the agency that youth are committed to in the juvenile justice system in DC. So technically, they can't just write me and ask, do you know of this youth? But what they can do is they can make a referral directly to me. So I would be open, definitely. Please email me and we can talk independently. But I would definitely be open to using something similar. It's just a form that you fill out with information about the youth, and that is a problem. One of the problems we have with counting the number of youth who are dually involved is that we count youth who are dually involved in DC with DC systems. As far as I know, there's not a mechanism to count youth who are dually involved in Maryland or Virginia, and unfortunately, because we're so close to both of those borders, it happens a lot.
A similar question. I'm a CASA in a state of Delaware. Is there a point of contact to the Bridges program in my state?
There's not a Bridges program in your state.
So there you go. So yeah, so Mary would be the person, but so it would just be there's Bridges is a customized version of CASA basically in DC.
Yes.
That Mary has spearheaded. So yeah.
However, I'm happy and have consulted with other CASAs who want to do similar things. If it's something that you or your CASA organization are interested in, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to talk to you about what we've done and to share any information or insight.
This is nicely segueing into the next question, which is, I'm a CASA volunteer with 2 teenagers. How do I get the social worker to be more supportive and involve me more in decision making?
Oh, that's such a great question. Wow, that's the $1 million question. I think, one, be compassionate to your social worker, and I'm not saying that you aren't, but just, if you give just a little bit, it can go a long way, because social workers sometimes look at us and say, who's this person? Who's this volunteer coming in here? They don't do this for their work. They don't know. And it can just be hard because they have a lot of ownership over their work. They may have 30 kids. You have 1 or 2. So that would be my first suggestion. My second suggestion is lean on your supervisor. Supervisors have a wealth of knowledge and experience. Sometimes we can think of different strategies. But also, be a squeaky wheel. I tell this to advocates all the time. And there's a tactful way to do it, right? So make it well known. I want to come to team meetings. Hell, there's a school meeting. I want to come. Send emails regularly. And when you send an email, give something. So give something to get something. So give your assessment you can do this to the entire team, or you can do this just to the social worker, but you can say, hey, I had a visit with Jane. It went really well. I just wanted to share this with you. What's going on your end? What's your perspective? Are there any team meetings coming up?
So this is a question I think for both you, Macon, for the group. So there's 2 related questions. Can you speak on how this work can best be evaluated and analyzed, and also how have outcomes improved with your program? So that's a nice research analysis question.
Well, I can speak for Bridges. So the program was launched in June. One of the things that we did and we're continually working on is going back through all of the data that we had and auditing the data to see where youth had been involved in juvenile justice, and then look at outcomes for those particular youth. Unfortunately, it wasn't particularly scientific because we weren't consistently tracking when youth were involved in the juvenile justice system. And oftentimes it gets siloed into this very specific situation, which is, so sometimes you'll hear it called dual-jacketed youth. So the assumption is, if they have cases that run concurrent, like that's when we're talking about them crossing over. But instances like a youth who has a juvenile case in Virginia but a child welfare case in DC, that's technically they're dual-jacketed, but also technically they're crossing over. Those are situations that kind of get lost because people think about it in this very specific way. So one of the things I had to do as a program manager with our staff is redefine the way that we were going to think about crossover and make very clear that documentation had to happen in all of these different circumstances. So from there, I have quarterly consultations with all of our supervisors for all of these cases. We do goal planning So one of our goals is tracks recidivism. So we look for no juvenile justice contact for a 6-month period. We look at other outcomes like educational success. So is the youth enrolled in school? Do they have an IEP? So some of this data tracking we do just because this is the data tracking that we're doing in DC. So because the program is so new, I don't have we have starting points, and then in the next year, we'll look at where those starting points moved.
Fantastic.
I don't know if Macon wanted to add to just general.
No, I don't have anything additional to add, Mary.
Fantastic. So I think we pretty much covered the questions. If anyone else has any more, please feel free while I'm wrapping everything up. So this is being recorded. So what we'll do is we will send the recording of the webinar out to all of our attendees. Expect an email from us once everything's been processed. We will also send out a PDF of the presentation. You can also find in the handout section of your little control panel the flyer for Bridges.
Which also has
exactly. So we'll make sure that you have Mary's email, you have the CJJR website, you have the CASA DC website, and you'll have Mary's email address. So please get in contact with us. We are excited to engage with you further on this. And thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of the day. All right. Take care.